The night the plane disappeared over the Gulf was supposed to be quiet. The small chartered Learjet left from a private airstrip outside of Corpus Bay, Texas, carrying 3 passengers and a sealed duffel that, according to the manifest, contained pharmaceutical research materials. In reality, it carried $4.3 million in cash, bundled tight and packed under the seat of a man named Ramon Silva, the head of the Cardenas cartel's North Coast branch. The 2 pilots knew to keep their mouths shut. One of them had flown Ramon before, had seen the cold glint of his ring when he signed a bill of lading. At 21:42, the plane lifted through thin clouds and leveled east toward Miami. What no one knew was that 2 men, Luke Ferris and Daniel Cortez, had been watching that flight for weeks, tracing its patterns, learning its habits. Luke, a former mechanic at the same airfield, knew the schedule, the maintenance codes, the guards' shifts. Daniel, once a cargo handler, had a brother who disappeared after a cartel delivery went wrong. For both men, the plan was part revenge, part survival. They didn't call it a robbery. They called it correction. The week before the heist, Luke sold his car and bought a 1982 Ford panel van. He replaced the plates with fakes and hid inside it a set of oxygen masks, a handheld radio, and an old police scanner tuned to air traffic frequency. Daniel borrowed 2 pilot uniforms from a storage locker that still carried the scent of jet fuel and stale coffee. They rehearsed in an abandoned hangar, timing every movement. 7 minutes to intercept, 3 to unload, 2 to vanish. On the night of April 12, 1993, the air hummed with the low buzz of insects and the distant pulse of an incoming storm. The men crouched near the fence as the Learjet taxied toward the runway. Luke whispered, "There it is. Same tail number." Daniel nodded, his jaw tight. When the engine screamed and the plane began to move, Luke's hands didn't tremble. He'd already disconnected one of the runway's remote lights earlier that day. The flicker distracted the tower just long enough for them to slip through a maintenance gate and start the van. By 2200 hours, they were chasing the plane's ascent signal across the dark stretch of coastal highway. At 2214, a sudden burst of static came through the scanner. Flight 702 requesting emergency reroute due to cabin pressure failure. No one suspected it was part of their plan. Luke had bribed a technician to load a modified valve that would release compressed air mid-flight, forcing an unscheduled landing. They knew where: a decommissioned strip on the Louisiana coast, 20 miles from the nearest light. "That's our window," Luke said. "Once it touches down, we move." The rain started before they arrived, thick and blinding, turning the asphalt into a mirror. The Learjet's lights appeared like 2 white ghosts through the curtain. It landed hard, bounced once, then rolled to a stop. Luke killed the van's engine. Silence except for the hiss of the storm. The 2 men ran toward the plane, weapons drawn but not raised. Through the cockpit window, they saw the captain arguing with Ramon Silva, who was shouting into a satellite phone. "Tell them to send another bird." His voice cracked through the rain. Luke banged on the fuselage with the butt of his pistol. "Step out. Emergency inspection." The pilots hesitated. Daniel yanked the hatch open and shouted, "Federal maintenance. Get out now." In the chaos, the men stormed inside. The smell of money, paper, ink, sweat, mixed with aviation fuel. Ramon reached for his gun, but Luke kicked it away, yelling, "Sit down!" The older pilot froze. The younger one tried to reach for the radio and caught Daniel's elbow instead. The fight was quick, brutal, quiet. 30 seconds later, Luke zipped the duffel shut and tossed it toward the hatch. "We're clear," he said. "Go!" They disappeared into the night, dragging the bag through puddles that glittered under lightning. By the time local deputies arrived, the jet sat empty, its cabin lights flickering, the rain washing away footprints. The official report said, unspecified mid-flight malfunction and emergency landing. Passengers missing. But within an hour, every cartel channel in the Gulf was burning with one question. Who had taken Ramon's money? The first body turned up 3 days later. One of the pilots washed ashore near Biloxi, hands bound with zip ties. The coroner said drowning, but the bruises told a different story. 2 days later, a farmer found a burned-out Ford van in a field outside Lafayette. No bodies, no bag. Just a melted police scanner and a broken wristwatch stopped at 22:47. Investigators from the state police were pulled off after 24 hours. The case was handed quietly to a joint task force that never issued a statement. But a year later, an audio tape surfaced in a pawn shop in Baton Rouge. It was labeled APR 12_FLT 702. The first minute was static. Then a man's voice, calm, low, almost regretful, said, "You think we did this for money? You don't know what they did to my brother." Analysts compared the voice to Daniel Cortez, but the accent didn't match. No one could explain how the tape reached the pawn shop or who brought it there. By then, both Luke and Daniel had vanished from every known address. Their families claimed they moved north for work. Others said they were dead, buried somewhere in the swamps. But in 1998, a maintenance worker at Corpus Bay found an old metal locker sealed shut with rust. Inside, a pilot's uniform, a worn photo of 2 men beside a hangar, and a torn piece of paper with a map of the Louisiana coast. On the back, scrawled in faded ink, "Debt settled. We go quiet." The handwriting matched Luke Ferris. Yet the story didn't end there. In 2001, a customs agent in Miami seized a crate of counterfeit bills that bore the same serial range as the stolen cash. The paper texture was wrong, too soft, too new. Tests showed they were reprints, made from the original plates. Someone had reproduced the money years later, flooding small transactions along the coast. A retired FBI analyst named Howard Kent started digging through old case files and found that several of those bills turned up near a small town called Riverbend, 200 miles inland. Riverbend had one notable resident, a mechanic named Lucas Farrell, same initials, same birth year as Luke Ferris. When agents arrived at his garage, the man was gone. The only thing left was a stack of receipts and a Polaroid of a plane, small silver with faded markings. On its tail, barely visible, the letters 702. "It's him," Kent said, staring at the photo. "He's still out there." The media caught wind, spinning the story as the ghost pilots of Corpus Bay. Local talk shows speculated that the robbers had become folk heroes, modern Robin Hoods who stole from the cartel. But the truth was less romantic. A declassified memo from 2003 revealed a coded bank transfer from a shell company in Belize to a name listed as D. Cortez, made just 6 months after the heist. The amount, $2.15 million, exactly half of what was stolen. Somewhere, the split had been honored. And then, another twist. An anonymous letter sent to a journalist in 2006, written in trembling cursive, began with 4 words, "He never forgave me." The letter described a remote cabin near Riverbend where 2 men argued one night about whether to burn the duffel bag or keep it. Luke said we could start over. Daniel said it wasn't about starting over, it was about finishing something. The next morning, the cabin was empty, the hearth cold, a single bullet lodged in the wall. Investigators found no bodies, but beneath the floorboards, they recovered a cassette labeled R. The audio began with rain, then silence, then a whisper. "They'll come for us, even if they don't remember why." For years, that tape remained in evidence storage until 2020, when a digital restoration revealed faint sounds beneath the static. A heartbeat monitor, a hospital intercom, someone saying, "Patient Ferris, Time of death, 317, which raised the question. If Luke Ferris died in 1993, who made the recording? And if Daniel Cortez vanished, who kept the promise to split the money? The final clue appeared in an auction catalog in 2021. Lot 314 vintage aviation duffel. Unclaimed baggage, contents unknown. The item photo showed a faded leather bag with a torn handle. Initials LF barely visible. It sold for $1,200 to an anonymous buyer in Miami. 2 months later, the auction house burned down under accidental circumstances. The surveillance tapes were missing. As of today, the case remains open. The FBI file lists it under internal reference Operation Quiet Flight. What began as a robbery turned into a ghost story. One about loyalty, vengeance, and the price of silence. Somewhere out there, pieces of that night still move quietly through hands that never knew their history. Every few years, a bill surfaces, marked with the faint scent of jet fuel, its edges softened by time, its serial number whispering back to that storm in 1993. And those who still chase the legend say if you hold one long enough, you'll hear the rain. If you want to know what they found next, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Years had passed since the stormy night over the Gulf, yet the memory of Flight 702 lingered like a shadow across the law enforcement files of the southern coast. Howard Kent, now semi-retired, had never stopped thinking about the ghost pilots, the missing millions, and the fragments of evidence that refused to fit neatly into the official narrative. In 2008, a tip from a retired courier named Miguel Alvarez reignited the case. Alvarez had delivered small packages along the Louisiana corridor in the early 1990s and remembered seeing a duffel bag, abandoned in the back of a barge, that had the distinctive scuff marks matching photographs of Luke Ferris's bag. "I thought it was just a shipment lost at sea," he told the agent on the line, his voice trembling. But now, maybe it wasn't. Kent took the information seriously, assembling a small team of analysts, some new, some veterans like himself. They started cross-referencing bank records, flight logs, and unclaimed baggage auctions, looking for any trace of the stolen $4.3 million. By 2009, they identified a series of small, offshore accounts under names that bore the initials LF and DC, funneling sums that seemed insignificant on the surface but added up over years. Each deposit corresponded to minor aviation transactions, car repairs, or cash transfers in towns near Riverbend. The pattern suggested that one or both of the men were alive, moving quietly, leaving breadcrumbs but never enough to be caught. One spring evening, Kent received a letter in an unmarked envelope, postmarked from Baton Rouge. Inside was a Polaroid showing a rustic cabin by the river, a small plane tied to a makeshift dock, and a handwritten note. "Some debts are paid, some linger. D." The handwriting matched Daniel Cortez's known script from previous evidence. Kent felt a chill. This was no taunt. It was a breadcrumb leading to a place he had already mapped out but had avoided, fearing the danger. By mid-2010, Kent's team began interviewing long-forgotten witnesses. A cafe owner remembered 2 men matching Luke and Daniel's descriptions, paying in cash, staying for weeks, never leaving footprints in local gossip. "They ordered black coffee, no sugar," she said, "but they watched the river constantly, like they were waiting for something." The agents began piecing together a timeline. The plane heist had been only the beginning. Luke and Daniel had used the stolen money to create a network of shell businesses, ostensibly legitimate, but primarily serving as a cover for moving small amounts of cash quietly to communities and family members left in their past. None of the money returned to the cartel, but the men's lives remained enshrouded in shadows. The breakthrough came when a digital restoration of the 1993 cassette revealed a faint secondary audio track, nearly imperceptible under the rain and static. A voice speaking softly in Spanish. We can't leave it all behind. They'll hunt us if we do. Linguists confirmed it was Daniel's voice. Paired with archival flight logs, it suggested the men had remained near the Gulf for months after the heist, watching for cartel movements, but never re-engaging with criminal networks. In 2012, investigators traced a series of coded letters sent via post offices across the South. Each envelope contained a single $100 bill, carefully folded, stamped with a date and location. Analysts called it a financial breadcrumb trail, marking locations where Luke and Daniel had deposited funds, seemingly as atonement or for some unspoken obligation. At the same time, Howard Kent traveled to Riverbend and spoke with locals who had vague memories of two men appearing and disappearing with uncanny timing. One farmer remembered seeing the men repairing a small plane hidden in a barn. They were careful, almost reverent. It wasn't a robbery. They were protecting something. By now, the investigation had become less about prosecution and more about understanding the psychology of two men whose lives were defined by one act of audacity. In 2014, Kent obtained access to the original auction records for the duffel bag sold in 2021, a lead he had held onto for years. The buyer remained anonymous, but the serial numbers of the bills were traced back to the original stolen cash, confirming that at least some of the money had survived, untouched by criminal hands, only to reappear decades later. This revelation prompted the team to consider a moral question. Had Luke and Daniel, in some unorthodox way, kept their promise to themselves to avoid unnecessary bloodshed and to keep the money out of the cartel's hands? In 2015, a retired FBI field agent shared his personal journal from the early 2000s, recounting a night when he had spotted a small plane landing in Riverbend, its pilot invisible in the cockpit, and a single duffel being moved into a cabin. The notation read, "The ghosts are still moving." That same year, Kent interviewed the sister of Daniel Cortez. She described Daniel as a man torn between loyalty and guilt, never showing off his wealth, always leaving small gifts for neighbors and relatives, explaining them as just keeping accounts balanced. It was consistent with the breadcrumbs the investigators had been tracking. By 2016, Kent's team used satellite imagery and local records to identify a pattern of cabin locations along tributaries feeding into the Mississippi River. Each showed signs of habitation, but no one could confirm the occupants. The conclusion seemed inevitable. The two men had created a mobile sanctuary, moving between cabins and maintaining a low profile, leaving a trail only curious and meticulous investigators could follow. In 2017, a retired customs agent discovered an envelope at a flea market in Baton Rouge containing a flight manifest, scribbled over with initials matching Luke and Daniel, and a faded map of the Gulf Coast, marked with a series of red dots. On the back, in careful handwriting, "Some debts require time to settle." It was the first evidence that the men had systematically divided the stolen money over years, perhaps as part of a personal code. By 2018, a young investigative journalist received an anonymous email containing a digital photograph of the two men taken decades prior, standing side by a riverbank, the duffel bag between them. The caption, "Even ghosts leave traces." She published an article titled, "The Gulf Heist That Time Forgot," sparking renewed public interest. Kent noted that while the article lacked sensational detail, it captured the moral complexity. These weren't merely thieves, but men negotiating the consequences of one violent night. In 2019, archival footage surfaced from a local television crew who had recorded weather coverage over the Gulf. On a low-resolution segment, a tiny plane can be seen skimming near the river, matching the size and model Luke had used. Analysts cross-referenced wind patterns and concluded that the plane was likely piloted by the same individuals, suggesting they were actively avoiding large hubs and sticking to secluded waterways. During the same year, Kent obtained testimony from an elderly retired mechanic who had serviced small aircraft along the coast. He recalled repairing 2 planes at different times for men who never provided full identification, paying only in cash, never asking questions, and leaving quickly. The mechanic remembered, "They were not afraid of the law, they were careful of themselves." By 2020, a composite of all evidence suggested that Luke Ferris had likely died quietly sometime in the mid-2000s, leaving Daniel Cortez to manage the residual operations. However, the trail was never definitive. In early 2021, an old tape, labeled R, was digitally restored and revealed faint background noises. A creaking cabin, rain against tin roofing, and a voice whispering, "The ledger is balanced. For now." Kent interpreted this as Daniel signaling closure, possibly the end of their long flight from the past. The final piece of the puzzle arrived in 2022 when a local historian unearthed the original metal locker hidden in an abandoned hangar, containing letters, maps, and small cash bundles meticulously cataloged. Each item bore dates spanning the years after the heist, suggesting a methodical process of accountability. There was no arrogance, no desire for fame, only a careful documentation of what had been taken and how it had been dispersed. Howard Kent, now in his late 70s, reflected on the case in his personal notes. "The men were never caught, never charged, and perhaps never meant to be. What remains is a story of calculation, consequence, and moral ambiguity. They chose silence and movement over violence. They survived, in shadows, leaving behind fragments of proof that the world could follow but never fully grasp. The investigation officially remains open, though the public files are sparse. Scholars of crime and criminal psychology reference Operation Quiet Flight as a seminal example of criminal strategy intertwined with moral restraint. In Riverbend and along the Gulf Coast, locals occasionally report seeing small planes at dawn, landing or taking off in solitude, no one aboard visible, leaving only the faintest trace of fuel and the whisper of time passing. The stolen money? Parts of it resurfaced in community donations, small anonymous payments, and rare transactions traced back to the original accounts. It seems the men, in their own cryptic way, attempted restitution while never fully surrendering themselves to authority. The duffel bag that started it all may have survived, lost to time or claimed by some anonymous hand, carrying its story silently to the present. The ghosts of that night, Luke Ferris and Daniel Cortez, remain elusive, their motives partially understood, their humanity partially revealed. The mystery continues to inspire investigators, journalists, and curious minds, a reminder that even the most audacious acts can leave behind traces of conscience. Perhaps one day, someone will uncover the full ledger, understand the balance, and finally answer the question: were they criminals or simply men who tried to survive and make right what was wrong? Until that day, the story lives in fragments. A Polaroid, a faded duffel, a cassette tape, and the faint echo of a storm over the Gulf. All characters are fictional or altered, and if real events inspired this story, sources have been verified.